What makes the quintessential American family? Is it their beliefs? What they look like? Their statistics? Is it what they had for dinner last night? Their general demeanor? Philanthropy? Maybe it's their relatability. Maybe the quintessential American family, the epitome of the American dream, is so relatable, so recognizable, that everything they are, have ever been, and likely will ever be, can be called to mind with nothing more than a simple, unassuming. What's up, Addamses? I'm Jaden, and today we're going to talk about the history of the Addams family. There are a few things that are considered pretty quintessentially American. Apple pie, eagles with receding hairlines, that one Shirley Temple Legacy Collection commercial that was on TV for like 20 years.
Animal crackers in my soup.
Something that you probably didn't add on that list that is just as American as all of those things is the Addams family. See, they've been around for a lot longer than a lot of people seem to think. The earliest version of the Addams family is from around 1935, when a young man by the name of Chaz Addams got a job with the New York Times drawing one-panel comics of ghoulish fiends going through traditional American pastimes. It was essentially a snapshot of the ideal American life, except not. By 1938, a few years later, and also, fun fact, the same year that the first Superman comic was ever published, a couple of recognizable figures had stepped out amongst these panels, and the idea of them as the Addams family was born, though none of the characters would actually be named until a bit later. Being born directly in the wake of the universal monster movie craze, and as contemporaries to the rise of pulp fiction and weird horror that was currently sweeping the nation, these comics gained incredible familiarity across the American populace. The first two of the family to be christened with any actual names were Morticia and Wednesday, whose likenesses were used in a doll campaign in 1962. And shortly after that, specifically halfway through the run of the Andy Griffith Show, ABC started producing a TV show. This TV show would run on Fridays at 8:30 p.m. and was more or less picked up and developed as a direct competitor to CBS's hit show The Munsters. As a quick aside, pitting the Addams family and the Munsters against each other from a modern perspective is actually really silly because the tones and themes of the shows are fairly different, while the aesthetic, of course, is extremely similar. CBS's The Munsters was a much more good old-fashioned Leave It to Beaver American pastime, whereas the Addams family took a decidedly more liberal path with their politics. The Munsters was very father knows best, whereas at the time, the idea of Morticia and Gomez having a more equal and loving relationship was otherwise unseen on public television. Also, fun fact, one of the difficulties with making the Addams family into a TV show was that the producers actually had to get the rights from Chaz Addams' ex-wife, who, early in their marriage, had gotten him to sign over the rights for any film or TV adaptations of his comic to her. There's a lot more about this, and I will probably just make a video on Chaz Addams himself, because this first wife is pretty much directly Deborah Jelinski from Addams Family Values, I think it is. Anyway, both the Addams Family and the Munsters ran for 2 years until both the TV networks switched to colored filming, and it was decided that to maintain the TV show and switch everything over to something that would look better on colored film would be more expensive than the shows were actually worth, and thus both were canceled. The shows ended up airing as reruns fairly often and were still quite popular amongst the fandoms. Let me know down in the comments if you're more interested in hearing a biographical piece on Chaz Addams or a more in-depth Addams Family versus the Munsters look at why they were pitted against each other by their respective studios. While the show was running on television, the New York Times didn't produce any more comics by Chaz Addams, but once the show was taken off, the comics began coming again, and mostly all was quiet on the Addams Family front until Warner Brothers got a hold of it. Scooby-Doo and the Addams Family aired in 1972 as part of the new Scooby-Doo movies, otherwise known as the most ambitious crossover event in television history. This particular movie I did go back and watch again, I guess, because I'm pretty sure I've seen almost all the Scooby-Doo things, which, let me tell you, is not a small list of things to have witnessed. But in this particular one, I will say, watching it from a 2020 perspective, Shaggy is all okay boomer all over the place, so that's not as fun. Anyway, the animation for the characters was based directly off of the comics that everyone had by this point been more or less exposed to, and audiences loved it so much that studios immediately got to work on an animated version of the Addams Family. Or at least, they tried to. Titled The Addams Family Funhouse, this was an animated Addams Family musical variety show. So for those of you in the modern era who aren't quite sure what a musical variety show is, essentially it's a TV show where people come on, musicians and famous people, and talk about their music and give shows, and it's sort of a... I don't know, there isn't a lot like it currently. Anyway, this show was such a bad idea that it never made it past the first episode. But fret not, the same year, NBC came out with a version of The Addams Family that was much more popular. It deviated significantly from the original source material, in that now the Addams Family lived in an RV as opposed to a mansion, and it is the first installation in the Addams Family chronology that had its own independent theme song, separate from the one introduced in the 1960s TV show. Essentially, the Addams Family traveled around in their RV to different places and getting into different hijinks. This TV show in turn spawned a comic book series that only released 3 issues. In 1977, ABC had a television reunion movie air, which was,
Look! They're French! Uncle Pa's a throttle is changed, no fair!
a mistake. After that, there really wasn't much about the Addams Family. There were rumors at one point that Tim Burton was going to get rights to the Addams Family, but thankfully that didn't happen. Enter November 1991. Paramount Pictures releases the film that skyrockets Addams Family back into public eye. Simply known as The Addams Family, this film grossed $191.5 million worldwide. That's 6 times the film's budget, which was already $5 million over its proposed expenses. Now, as a millennial, I can easily tell you that The Addams Family and The Addams Family Values are probably in the top 10 most iconic movies from the 90s that I've ever seen. But on its release, this film actually did fairly badly with reviews and critics. The general consensus was that it was a funny film with good one-liners and not a lot of heart or story. But despite this, the film was nominated for several awards, some of which make more sense than others. And this 1991 film spawned a bunch of video games. It also inspired the Addams Family pinball game, which is, to date, the most popular and successful pinball game that has ever been made. Who would have thought? In the wake of the first film, ABC spawned a fairly successful cartoon version, yet again just called The Addams Family, that ran for 2 seasons, and the original family was back in their mansion. And then, the sequel, The Addams Family Values, released in 1993 to the #1 box office position worldwide. Domestically, though, the sequel barely managed to scrape any profit. But, yet again proving that box office numbers are completely worthless and no one actually cares what professionals in the film industry think about things, the film was instantly beloved and considered by many Americans an instant classic. In short, the audience loved it. Unfortunately, before the sequel was really fully finished, the actor who played Gomez passed away, and there was no talk of any continuation of that particular rendition of the series without his participation. The Addams Family might finally rest. At least, it did for a little while. It's 1998. The world's in a weird place. The global space station launches, there's wars all over the planet, Google is founded, and in the midst of all of this chaos, perhaps the greatest tragedy of the year, Saban Entertainment releases this. The Addams Family Reunion, starring Tim Curry and some other people that you probably haven't heard of by name, was released direct to video. It was originally intended to be an edgier version of the Addams Family to fit the late 90s, early 2000s aesthetic, I guess. But, as studios do, the studio decided it was too something, and decided to cut out all of the things that actually made it edgy, leaving behind a strange, monstrous dumpster fire of an accident that not even Tim Curry could save. Everyone hated it. So much so that when I talk to other people who are fans of the Addams Family, when I bring up this version, they either get this glazed look on their face, look back at me and go, I'm sorry I blacked out for a minute, or don't know what I'm talking about because it's been so successfully buried in the depths of bad 90s CGI hell that should never really be dug back up. Sorry, what happened? I blacked out there for a second. That same year, YTV Canada released The New Addams Family, a live-action TV show that sure was made in 1998. It ran for one season, and it seemed like after that the general craze was dying, and that everyone sort of agreed that the 1991 and 1993 films would never really be beaten. But, as the film industry will do, as time rolled on, those kids that grew up with the Addams Families from the 90s got older. Big media realizes that nostalgia is in vogue. Geek and fringe culture is in the mainstream. Universal is trying to rebuild the monster movie franchise. The Hollywood gods that be decided that it was time to indoctrinate another generation to Addams Family shenanigans. Enter 2019. I'm gonna be honest, I was dreading this movie, but I actually kind of thought it was cute. It was fun and entertaining and, made for kids, which I think is something people tend to forget. When you take the nostalgia goggles off, of course the things you liked when you were a kid are gonna top things that are coming out now, especially if the things that are coming out now aren't really being made for you. But reception on this one seemed to be pretty mixed. A lot of people thought it was fine, a lot of people did not like it. One of the main criticisms that it kept getting was the idea that it was too politically minded. But that doesn't really make sense as a complaint because the Addams Family has always been a political machine, ever since its conception. The original comic from the 1930s was a satirical depiction of American family that used inversion to make commentary on the need of the American family to keep up with appearances and always look the part. By making the main characters offbeat individuals who were either unaware of or didn't care about other people's opinions, that in and of itself was extremely political. The 1960s TV show was borderline revolutionary in its depiction of a married couple that actually has physical affection. Not to mention the, for its time, in-depth looks at gender roles in society and constant commentary on a lack of privacy in Cold War USA. The 73 cartoon comments in separate episodes about everything from the petroleum crisis to the space race. I mean, fuck, even the title, The Addams Family Values, was intended to be commentary on the Republican ideas of constantly pushing family values, and the idea that the only American families that valued were the ones that looked like everybody else. Middle class, white, stereotypical. The only version of the Addams Family that went out of its way to be in any way apolitical was Addams Family Reunion. And you're really not going to sit here and tell me that that was your favorite Addams Family. To be clear, the point of this is not to shame anyone for what they do or don't like, or having preferences for the things they grew up with over new things that come out. Variety is the spice of life. We all have different reasons for liking and disliking what we respectively like or dislike. The point I'm trying to make, I guess, is that if you dislike something, it's important to ask yourself why you don't like it. If you didn't like the New Addams Family because you thought it was too political, is that what you don't like, or you don't like that the politics it voiced weren't necessarily the ones that you agree with? Or do you think that politics doesn't have place in a kids show, which is a fair criticism of something, and I can understand that perspective, but if that's the case, then Addams Family probably was never your bag. Or you simply overlook the things that you liked when you were younger because nostalgia goggles. Maybe, in the New Addams Family, you weren't a fan of on-the-nose humor. Maybe you don't like the glorification of the macabre in children's media. In which case, fair enough, but what did you think this movie was going to be? Maybe you inherently dislike it because it's a remake and it's not as good as the one you grew up with. But the one you grew up with, unless you grew up with the original comic, isn't like the ones before it either. When talking about the original TV show, Chaz Addams himself said that he wished his characters were portrayed more ghoulishly. They were no longer the villains he had originally intended, and he felt that the show lost a lot of his commentary because of that. And that ties into the idea that the newer version of something is always inherently worse than the older version. All remakes are garbage, reboots are unnecessary, which is called original privilege, by the way. But if you subscribe to that, do you really think that this was better than this? For 90 years, the main purpose of the Addams Family has been to demonstrate that different isn't always bad. That weird, outlier, outcast can all have its own values and be good. And that just because something doesn't necessarily make sense to you doesn't always mean it's worse. It has been subconsciously arguing for the rights and inclusion of people outside the mainstream since its conception. And that, I think, is something worth rebooting and remaking for every generation that might need to hear it. Because I know if they tried to teach my generation that with this, it would probably make about as much sense to me as the kids nowadays trying to get those same messages from this. And having something that says that to kids and puts that message out there when they might not otherwise get it is honestly worth all the bad jokes and garbage can CGI that you can really put out there. But I swear to God, Netflix, if you mess up this new Addams Family show, I will...
You haven't seen Shirley until you've seen her brilliantly restored in black and white and in color. Presenting the Shirley Temple Little Darling DVD collection. 18 timeless films packed with hours of her unforgettable singing.
Animal crackers in my soup. Monkeys and rabbits loose